Welcome back to the Practical Church Podcast. My name is Dylan Dawson, and I hope this podcast finds you well as we kick off a new year of ministry together. Today in the podcast, I'm going to share with you my 2025 church predictions, and I'll also recap my 2024 church predictions as well. Before we dive into that, as always, this show is brought to you in partnership with Mission Support. Mission Support knows you want to be effective in ministry, but if you're like most pastors, you probably feel like you never have enough time, energy, or expertise to get everything done. What better time than the beginning of the year to head to missionsupport.com. They help with things like bookkeeping, SEO, payroll, websites, a lot of back-end stuff that's kind of draining to a lot of pastors and ministry leaders. So talk to a guy today at missionsupport.com and see how you can go from feeling scattered to focused on your mission again. Of course, if you want more from the show, you can go to missionsupport.com/practical. And now let's get into today's episode. All right, 2025 church predictions. I've got 5 of them for you. Before I jump into those, I'm going to do a recap of my 2024 church predictions that was shared at the beginning of the 2024 podcast season. All right, so here are the 5 2024 church predictions. We're just going to see how I did. Now, I just want to say this, obviously, these predictions are anecdotal based on my experience. I don't have data to necessarily check all this stuff. And not all these things can be necessarily verifiable, but I'll just give some reflections on how I think things went based on my observation, which of course my predictions are also based on my observation as well. So just a caveat, I'm not saying these predictions are true for the whole entire global church. I wouldn't know that at all, just from the things I've experienced, particularly in the American church is my context. So here is my 5 2024 church predictions. Here was the first one. Churches that understand that they have a new church will be better than those who don't. So the beginning of last year, 24, churches that understand they have a new church, quote unquote, will be better than those who don't. Now, I do remember going into 2024, it was the first year, now this does a little depend on where you live, that COVID was no longer a thing. Because even in Raleigh where I am, in 2023, there were still people, restrictions had come back and gone, and still people kind of living under this, I'm not going to go anywhere because of COVID. That kind of started to go away in 23. Where I lived was pretty restrictive. 24 was okay, COVID's not a thing that people are necessarily worried about. The average person isn't planning their day around COVID stuff. So it was the first year to do ministry as normal since the pandemic began for an entire year. But because of that, there had been a lot of change. There had been a lot of turnover. People had moved. People had stopped coming. A lot of new people had come. More so than the typical 2 to 3 year period of churches. And so my prediction was that if you understand you have a new church, you'll be better than those who don't. Now, I think some of the ways this plays out is being really clear on your assimilation process and connecting people, not assuming that everyone who's been at your church knows why you do everything. And so I think churches, I think in some ways, again, this is hard to verifiably give an answer of was I right or wrong. But I just think, even in 2025, if you've been around for a while, it's still helpful to remember that we've got a lot of new people. And so maybe this having to be intentional about rebuilding culture, the vibe or the energy or the experience, probably a better word, that you're trying to create at your church. Is it still happening? Is it changing? Churches that understand that they are a new church will do better than those who don't. I guess I would say, yeah, sure. It's hard to verify for sure. But I think if you understand it's just intentional, there's been a lot of new people proportionally or percentage-wise than a typical last couple of years. And you led in that direction, I think you probably experience some better things. And just assuming that everybody knows what you're doing or knows why you're doing what you're doing. So that was one prediction. Another prediction I had last year was that in-person Sunday attendance is still a vital metric to track and lead people towards. In-person Sunday attendance is still a vital metric to track and lead people towards. Now, it's kind of funny. I can see how COVID really shaped some of these predictions. Especially now, I don't think anybody would be well, duh. But I just remember, man, coming out of COVID, there was whole this is it ever going to be the same? Online, blah, blah, blah. And one of the things, even on this podcast, we kind of said from the very beginning, was you can't replace human connection. And I think part of the reason why this is such a big thing now is people are realizing we need real life human relationships, especially with so many people working from home as well. And so again, there can be this tendency to downplay the importance of Sunday morning. And I just want to say I'm the complete opposite. Practical Church is the complete opposite. It's man, so much comes out of Sunday morning. And I think a lot of us experienced this during COVID. people got connected, they take their next steps, they start serving, get in a group, whatever. None of that happens, at least in an American context, until they go to the Sunday service, or at least a little bit to get to know people, okay? So churches that attendance is a vital metric to track and lead people towards, again, I think, churches that do that have a priority on their Sunday gathering, that try to have a good gathering, that are intentional about reaching out to new people and following up with guests, all that sort of thing. That are doing much better than people that are kind of like downplaying how important Sunday is. So I think that's definitely true, still true. In-person Sunday attendance is still a vital metric to track and lead people towards. I think in 2025 now, that's probably that's obvious. That obviously wasn't obvious a year ago, at least a lot of the conversations I was seeing and hearing. So Sunday is very important. So much comes out of it. So many next steps people come out of it. It's not the end all be all, but it matters a lot. So you can't get to the end all be all without in my opinion, a helpful and good Sunday experience, worship service, a gathering of the saints together. So yeah, I think that was helpful. Third prediction, churches that raise or keep, depending on what's going on, the churches that raise or keep a high bar for their leaders will be more effective than those who make excuses. Those who raise or keep, if they had a high bar for the leaders, will be more effective than those who make excuses. This is important. I think, again, a lot of this was coming out of COVID. A lot of, we could kind of lower the bar or change our expectations to try to meet the cultural moment that we were in. People were less committed coming out of COVID. People were kind of more, kind of show up, kind of stayed home a lot more, that sort of thing. And it's no, the churches of man, here's our culture, here's what we do, here's what it looks like for us to be the local church God's called us to be, are going to be more effective. And again, one of the things we've said, even in some of the more recent episodes, I would rather have fewer people serving a part of the team, whatever, and leadership roles that are all excited and connected with the mission, than having more people that you're trying to grab and drag along on the process of being a ministry, because it also doesn't create a good culture for the new people coming in. And so churches that raise or keep a high bar for the leaders will be more effective than those who make excuses or try to explain away. It doesn't matter, kind of give people certain rules for certain people, but not for everyone else. I would just say, I think that's true and continues to be true. Having a high bar for the leaders is important because people will raise to the bar, the level that you set. They will. And so if you want the certain type of leaders of your church, man, are you not being unrealistic, but setting good, strong metrics and bars, or are you kind of this person could do it, but they can only do it at this time. I wouldn't do that. I'd rather have a vacant position than a position full of someone that you're trying to drag along to do something that's not kind of a fit with your mission and culture. Number 4, live stream / online engagement. So live streaming your service, but also being intentional with social media, YouTube stuff throughout the week online. A live stream online engagement will be the biggest missed opportunity to reach new people. I think that's true, and I still believe it. Now, my caveat here is, some people convictionally are against a live stream. And I would say, hey man, that's totally fine. If you're convictionally, for whatever reason, against a live stream, that's okay. It doesn't mean the other online engagement piece can't still happen. Really quickly, we do at New City Church, we get a number of new people who mention our live stream before they come for the first Sunday. Now, sometimes it is hard to know when they say live stream, do they mean they just watched a sermon online, or do they actually sit down and watch a live stream? From what I can gather, it's been both, because there have been times where I've really pressed people on what they mean by that, and they'll literally say no, people have literally said we've watched the last 3 Sundays. A live stream. It's okay, they're talking about they actually sat on their couch or whatever and watched it. So I think some of that actually is the live stream. I just think it's a big deal. Now, my caveat with this is don't expect being intentional with social media, therefore will lead to tons and tons of people coming to your church, but it does make a difference. It does make a difference. So I'm not saying New City is great. If you want an example, you can follow us, New City RDU, on YouTube or Instagram. Those are probably the best places to follow us to kind of see some of the videos and content we make. I've got other Practical Church podcast episodes. You can scroll down and look at some of those more recent ones that talk about social media and how to do it. But I'm just amazed at churches that don't spend time on it or the money, because it doesn't, once you get in a rhythm with it, it doesn't take a lot of money and it doesn't take a lot of time. I'm amazed too. He's a pet peeve of mine. I would really encourage you, churches that take their live stream, especially churches that are a little bit larger. So I'm saying over 100 people. But these examples, I can hundreds of people, if not over 1,000 people, will have their live stream, and then they'll just take their live stream and they'll put it on their website. Can I just remind you, nobody wants to watch your live stream unless they're actually watching it live. what you should do is you should take the sermon only. I mean, you should leave your live stream on YouTube or whatever, but you should also clip the sermon out or record the sermon separately like we do, or not from the live stream. It doesn't matter. Have a sermon on its own. However you want to do that. Have a sermon on its own. On your website, your sermons should just be sermons because people aren't going to try to click through and find it. Even on YouTube, if that's where you host your sermons, which I recommend, we have our live stream, but then we have a playlist of just sermons, and it is just our sermon. It's not the whole live stream, people trying to click around, finding where it is. That's just creating friction and for people to connect with you, because people aren't trying to like watch a live stream after it's live, if that makes sense. So I still think it's a big missed opportunity just because like it does not take the time and effort and money that people think it does. And it's pretty low-hanging fruit that makes a big difference. It's more shareable for your people. It's a way to stay in front of your people throughout the week, that sort of thing. I think that's 100% true. I still think it's true. This year will continue to be a big missed opportunity for people who don't spend any time on it. If you want to reach people where they are, you got to invest at least some of the money, like buy a nice camera, but that's not an ongoing purchase. Having a social media, Instagram, YouTube, whatever, TikTok, whatever your church has, that doesn't cost money. Like those platforms are free. It takes some time to record the content, but there's ways you can do that. Again, if you want to see what we do at New City, you can check us out online or come some of the previous episodes. I think it's still a big missed opportunity, real big one. And then number 5, Jesus-focused churches will continue to be the most New Testament reflective churches. Jesus-focused churches will continue to be the most New Testament reflective churches. What I mean by that, and I still see it now, it was really big, I think, coming out of COVID, was that you can be very partisan or very like over the top on a certain issue, maybe like sticking it to the government for how they handled COVID, which I disagree with that. And going back, I would do things differently too. Or obviously coming out of political season, I'm not saying that like both candidates or parties are equally right and equally wrong, therefore it doesn't matter. I'm not saying that, but I'm like, there's a type of church that you can like grow a little bit quicker if you kind of stand on some of these secondary issues that don't not matter, but they aren't the gospel. And so you can see a lot of that happening, but like New Testament churches that reflect Jesus, they'll speak to issues and they'll be willing to sound partisan if they need to, but like their primary focus is following Jesus and making disciples of Jesus and not like focusing primarily on like a certain political candidate or a certain issue that they're upset about, that sort of thing. They've got an axe to grind, a soapbox. Like, I'm not saying that Christians can't have conviction. I'm not saying that Christians should not be active in the public square. All those things are true, but we've got to make sure that the main thing is the main thing. And you can grow a church, at least in the short term, focusing on secondary issues and like making them a big issue and kind of saying everyone who disagrees with you like is not as faithful a Christian as you are, but they're not going to be the most New Testament reflective. Like when you read the New Testament, when you read the Gospels and the letters, like they speak to things, but they continue to go back to Jesus. So again, that was a little harder to predict, but I do remember going into 2024 seeing a lot of like really hyper certain focus on certain small issues, which will bring you a lot of attention online, but I don't think it'll be the most New Testament reflective. So those are 2024 church predictions. Now, let's get into my predictions for this year. Again, caveat, it's anecdotal. I can't see everything. I don't know everything. I'm not saying this is true for every single church. These are just my thoughts going into this year. Number 1. And this might go a little bit against what I just said, but I don't think it does. Number 1, being willing to sound partisan where scripture is clear will attract people to your church. Being willing to sound partisan where scripture is clear will attract people to your church. So for example, when it talks about, let's talk about the dignity of human beings. The Christian tradition, going back to ancient Rome, is caring for the marginalized and the infants that the parents would discard for the elements and didn't care about. Like from the beginning, the Imago Dei, all human beings are created in the image of God. They matter. If you talk about the issue of life, you will sound partisan. Now, I'm not going to get into it now. I think both parties fall woefully short. Both Democrat and Republican in the United States fall woefully short on like what God would say about the Imago Dei. Woefully short. However, policies is I'm going to really need to sound partisan on this podcast, and we'll see what happens. Policy issue aside, neither of them are consistently pro-choice. The Republican platform is a more pro-life platform than the Democrat platform. So especially coming out of a political season, if you spoke about the issue of life, people might have assumed, well, you must be voting for X, Y, and Z. My thing is like, we got to be willing to be honest about the issues, even if people assume that paints us into a box. If you want to go on maybe a left-leaning issue, if you talk about the care for the poor and the marginalized, because that's a scriptural thing that both parties don't get right. I would say that the left emphasizes it more, talks about it more, so they might assume certain things about you. I would say we have to be willing to teach what Scripture says and not be afraid of sounding partisan. Now, we don't go out of our way, but we don't need to like soften it. And again, I'll just say from my church circles, it's different for your context, certainly. I noticed in the last couple of years, there's a tendency to coddle left and punch right. And this isn't new to me. A lot of people talk about this. In other words, when you're talking about issues that are more sensitive to those on the left, we kind of use more soft language. So if you talk about the issue of life, you might be more soft and maybe nuance it to death. But when it talks about like the issues on the right, we'll go really hard and like talk about how, hey, people on the right, people more conservative, like they're wrong about this and they need to get better. So maybe talking about like carrying the poor and marginalized, like we'll use strong convictional biblical language. So we'll be soft on the issues that maybe the left would disagree with, but we'll be really hard against the issues the right disagrees with. And again, this is different, maybe a bit different based on your context. What I'm saying is, regardless if it sounds conservative or liberal, it does not matter. And I would say increasingly people, I guess, and especially in our culture where we're hearing all this stuff, all the news, all the media, like we're increasingly anxious. We're going our own way. We've been told for the last 30 years that self-esteem is the most important thing and we're awesome just the way we are. And we realize, hey, listen, like I've got a lot of issues and I'm not awesome and I'm not perfect just the way I am. But people are open to this stuff. And so we've got to be willing to sound partisan. And I would just say this actually will attract people to your church. Again, I want to be clear here, not intentionally trying to be partisan. But if you are preaching or teaching on a topic and people are going to assume, man, you really sound like a conservative or a liberal or a Republican or Democrat, that what people might perceive should make no difference in how we preach and communicate and lead. Okay, so if you want to put us in a box, that's fine, but do not be afraid to be honest about what the Scripture says about things, and I think you people will actually appreciate it. Be willing to sound partisan where Scripture is clear. And that will attract people to your church. Of course, as you do so, you meet love and grace. Grace and truth is what we see in scriptures. Grace and truth. We don't want to beat people over the head and tell them how stupid they are if they disagree with us. Here's what scripture says. We want to, with grace and with truth, lead people towards the light. So be willing to sound partisan where scripture is clear. I think will actually attract people to your church. Don't be afraid. Number 2, there will be an increase in American church attendance. Now, this one might actually be verifiable, but I guess there's some caveats here. I don't know about general church attendance. I think churches that are biblically sound and based, willing to sound partisan where scripture is, or whatever, where our culture thinks is partisan. Like, I think I would be surprised by the end of 2025 if we see an increase in maybe not overall church attendance, but churches that are more like theologically robust and maybe evangelical, although that's such like a broad term. I hate to use it. So I don't want to give myself much caveats. I just wouldn't be surprised if church attendance even goes up a little bit. In fact, there was a report in December from January to October in 24. There's a 22% increase in Bibles bought from that same period of January to October of 23. So 2024, there was a 22% increase in Bible purchase over 2023, the same period. I mean, people are interested about this stuff. Like, what does scripture actually say? We've been sold so much from the media, from culture and some social media that we just know like is not true. I would not be surprised if there's actually an increase in American church attendance in 2025, which means going back to maybe one of my predictions of 24, like Sundays matter. Because that's going to be their first step to your church. To actually getting connected is going to be on a Sunday morning on a weekend service. I wouldn't be surprised. So like, man, just prepare. Like, do whatever you can. Make sure your assimilation process is good. Like your next steps for people, like how you connect with guests, how they take their next step. Like, just be really intentional. Because I would not be surprised at all if we actually. I wouldn't see big, even if a plateau of church attendance, because it's been decreasing for so long. I just would not be shocked at all if there is a slight, either a plateau or even like a 1%, 2%. Increase in average church attendance would not shock me at all for 2025. Number 3, because of that, because I do think people are more willing to come to church a little bit more. Not everybody, I'm not saying like the whole nation, but just generally speaking, I do think this leads to number 3, that you can have your largest Easter or Christmas or special day attendance in your church's history. Now, if you're a church plant and you're planning in January 25, well, obviously. But even if you've been around for a while, I think there's a great opportunity because I think there's a little bit more of an openness to learning about the things of Scripture, that people are going to be even more open to Easter or Christmas. And if you have another special day that you traditionally do as well, but especially Easter or Christmas. So I would just encourage you to make them a really big deal, to do everything you can to invite. It's kind of interesting. We'll see how this goes. I mean, a lot of this podcast is like just sharing personal reflections over the years of things we've learned at New City. I'm recording this the week before Christmas. We do Christmas Eve every year at New City Church, so December 23rd, and this will be our seventh year as a church. We've always like talked about Christmas Eve, Christmas and Easter services, but we've never like really pushed them. And so as I'm recording this, I don't know what's going to happen. But what we have done in December, every month, all 4 Sundays in December leading up to Christmas Eve, we handed out an invite card as people were leaving the auditorium. Every week we talked about it. I give it to somebody. On December 15th, the third Sunday, we took like 5 minutes in our service and we had this like QR code thing. We had this whole spiel of like, hey, everyone take out your phones, like, and scan this QR code. They got an image sent to their phone. And we said, hey, right now, text somebody or post it on social media. And I've already heard a couple of people, like a really cool story today about someone who invited someone, which is really cool to hear. Like we've been very intentional about it, like pushed it a ton. Now, I don't know how much that's going to see. We'll see. Maybe in my next episode, I'll report back if I remember more than we ever have. Part of that is like we want to make a big deal about bigger days because the gathering is so important, even though that's not on Sunday, but still the gathering. But I just think like next year is going to be even more opportunity for it. And we're trying to train our people towards it. So I would just say like, my encouragement is for Christmas and Easter for 25, like take a whole month. The invite card thing was easy because we had like special Christmas Eve service invite cards made because like people don't feel like they're being sold to. It's like, yeah, I get it. Like people are more open. So every week we've talked about how people are more receptive, all these sort of things. Like I think our people are like, okay, they're gonna give me an invite card every single day, every week for a month. I'm fine with it. I'm not gonna be annoyed. And it's also cool too because it's like, we're just talking about inviting more. So even if they don't invite or come to Christmas Eve, it's like, are people who know like, oh, I should be inviting people to church. Like that's a thing. So all that to say, I think you can have your largest Easter or Christmas day attendance in your church's history if you're intentional about these days. We'll see next year if this is true for New City Church. I guess that will be very verifiable. Next year when I'm doing this episode again about church predictions, I can report back and see if that happened or not. I think it'll be happening. I think it's possible. Just got to work towards it. Number 4, vertical video is not going anywhere. Vertical video is not going anywhere. I mean, everybody's doing it now. I mean, even Amazon, like the Amazon app does it. LinkedIn does it. Everybody's doing it. So the reason, maybe this is not like a going out of a limb, but I would say like you need to invest in it. So going back to one of the 24 predictions about lack of live stream and online engagement will be the biggest missed opportunity to reach new people. Like this is a big missed opportunity. And we're at the point now with these social media platforms where you can post the same thing on all of them because like they go to different things, they throttle who all sees it. So you don't have to even think of different content. So like, we do 2 vertical videos every single week. One is we take a clip from the sermon, 60-ish seconds or less, maybe a little bit less, and it gets posted vertical video with subtitles and a little bit of background music. So we put subtitles on it, a little background music. It's posted on Instagram, gets posted on TikTok, and it gets posted on YouTube Shorts. Every week. And our YouTube channel has grown quite a lot for a church our size. For me, it's not so much, it doesn't necessarily, I don't know how much of a difference it makes on in-person attendance, but what it does do is if somebody's new and they go to our YouTube channel, they say, oh, that's legit. Like they're actually continually posting content. Like they actually take this seriously. I think it gives our church some legitimacy, which is why I like that. But I'd say it's not going anywhere. So invest in it. Like, so for us, again, we do the sermon clip that goes everywhere once a week, and then we do Bible in a minute, which you can steal it or whatever. Like, we take a minute and I just read a verse and explain it. We've been doing this for like 3 or 4 years. And so twice a week, we have a vertical video. And the point of them is not necessarily to go viral. Honestly, the point is to stay in front of our people. But you never know, like, what could happen and who can see it. And every once in a while, one takes off for some random reason. I don't know. And honestly, it really helps, to be honest. When we get comments of like, you're a heretic or like God, I get some of those, not a lot of those. A lot of those is like, God doesn't exist, you're stupid, the Bible's made up. But actually I enjoy those comments because then it, when you get comments and engagement, it actually shows the videos to more people. So I'm like, hey man, keep like saying all sorts of mean things to us and more people see the video. So it's awesome. So I'll let it say, vertical video is not going anywhere. You should invest in it. You can start with your phone. And then I would buy a camera. Spend $1,000, $2,000. Because if you're going to actually use it, man, it's going to make a big difference. Hold it vertically and then record. We've got if you're watching the YouTube version of this podcast, you can't see it now. I've got an overhead mic on top of me and it plugs right to the camera. And so we record these videos this way, especially with our Bible in a Minute. That's how they do it. We do them twice. We do 2 at a time. We post them every week. And so like every other week, I'm recording 2 of them with Brian, who's on staff here. And again, it doesn't take a ton of time because we've gotten to a quick rhythm. And so now the prep takes me, let's say the prep takes me like 7 minutes for 2 of them. I don't know. And then we've got to record them. Overall, I don't know. I can't speak for Brian. I would say maybe about 30 minutes. Let's just say 30 minutes. Well, 15 minutes per video is as much it takes. And it's a consistent thing that everybody sees. So, and you can post them everywhere. And we post them on Facebook too. So I guess Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. We'll see what else. We don't really do Twitter or X anymore right now because it's like, I don't know, we just never really got engagement with it. And I'm saying like, you don't have to do all the things. But if you prioritize vertical video, you can post it on every single platform, the same thing. And that's at least one, if not 2 videos a week, and you're well on your way to doing stuff. So I think vertical video is not going anywhere. It will continue, therefore, to be a missed opportunity if you don't do anything with it. Vertical video is not going anywhere, fourth prediction. Last but not least, number 5. Your Sunday experience will determine if people stay. Your Sunday experience will determine if people stay. Let me explain what I mean by this. I saw a post a couple weeks ago by, I forget where it was, but it was an online article from a publication that I actually like and enjoy, and I disagreed with it. And the post was talking about, I can't remember for sure, but it was one of the things in the post, it was basically this gist. How it was talking about how no one leaves a church because of the screen and the lighting. Like nobody leaves a church because like the auditorium was light weird, or like the technology was bad, or like the screens were hard to read. And it was talking about community and preaching. I'm like, yes, but I also don't fully agree, because here's why. No one will ever tell you I'm not coming back to your church because the service was awkward. Like nobody will tell you that. Because like it sounds bad. It's like whenever you do a self-survey on people about why they do certain things, they always they're always going to give false reasons because they want to sound good. Even anonymous surveys. Like people always, for example, say they go to church more than they do, or read the Bible more than they actually do, or pray more than they actually do because like it feels good. And it feels bad to like say you don't do something that you quote unquote think you should be doing. And so I don't believe those surveys. I also want to say like you might not be able to articulate it. And here's why this matters. I've seen churches like knock or like church hopping, whatever, and I get it. Like I don't like it either. But we got to be honest. Like we live in a time and a place. If you live in America, for example, well, there's like a lot of options. Like I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. There's a lot of really great biblically based, Jesus-loving churches. There's a lot of them. And I'm not saying your church has to be amazing by any means. But if somebody comes to a new city and it's like awkward and weird, like the service flow is like weird, like they're going to go somewhere else because they could drive the same distance and have a better experience. And here's why this matters. Like I'll just straight up say it. If I was not working in ministry, vocational ministry, I just had a normal job, a faithful follower of Jesus, like I would be going to a church that I could invite my friends to. Like it's not so much for me. I would be looking for a church that loves my kids well, and that I can invite my friends to. And if it's awkward, if the transitions are weird, like it's just going to be hard for me to invite my friends when there are other options out there. And so I don't know, this might not sound encouraging or whatever. All I'm just saying, like the Sunday experience really matters. It really matters. It does not have to be professional. It doesn't have to be as good as like the large church with a large budget down the street. It doesn't have to be that. But it does not need to be awkward. Like a small church can still do a run through before the service. It can still talk through the transitions. It can still like make sure, hey, the production team, like here's the slides. Like you want to make it distraction free and connectable, because there's other churches, depending on where you live, there might be a lot more, there might not be a lot more that have that option. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I'm pro having a lot of churches. Like I know the downside is like it's easier to leave, or like, if you make a bad decision or whatever, it's easy just to go somewhere else and to hide. I know that's not great, but your Sunday experience will determine if people say, depending on where you live, predominantly probably a Western, certainly predominantly American and a Western audience who are listening to this podcast. And so they have options, and people are not going to say, yeah, the service flow was awkward, that's why I left. They're not going to say that, but they are going to think it. They are going to think it. And so again, if you're portable, there's a lot of things, if you're portable or whatever, that you might not can control, but does it look like, hey, they've thought through this and they've obviously put time and effort. This is not saying you have to have the best equipment or the best lighting or the best whatever, but it needs to be like clearly that you've worked on it and thought about it, or else people are going to go somewhere else. But they're not going to say that's the reason. They're not going to say that's the reason. Now, of course, that's not always the reason, but I did disagree with this article. I'm like, man, I don't think no one's going to say I left because the service flow was awkward. Nobody's going to say that, because that doesn't sound right. They're going to say, well, the preaching wasn't good, or nobody talked to me, or whatever. But it can be true. It can absolutely be true. So my encouragement is like, your Sunday experience will determine if people stay. Again, we just got to be honest. Like the culture we live in matters. The culture we live in matters. We live in a culture where people can stay at home. They can do whatever they want. They can, in some ways, unfortunately, assume that there should be a certain level of excellence in churches, because when they go to sporting events or whatever, they go to all these other places, they're run smoothly. And so, yeah, you might not have the money or certain things that like certain other complexes or things have, but you can put in an effort. And so I just would say, man, your Sunday experience will determine if people stay. And you might say, well, that's always been the case. Sure. But I just think like that matters, and it will increasingly matter. It does not have to be the best, but it has to be, hey, we thought through intentionally our service, the lighting, the music, the preaching, all these things, they all matter. They all communicate something to somebody. And doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be the most excellent thing in the world, does not have to be. But it has to be intentional, and it has to be obvious that effort was put in. So I would just say that. So your Sunday experience will determine if people stay. So I know that's a lot of stuff I covered, so I'll just briefly, here are my 5 2025 church predictions again. Being willing to sound partisan where scripture is clear will attract people to your church. Number 2, there will be an increase in American church attendance. And I'm not saying a big one. I'm just saying like I wouldn't be shocked if it plateaus or goes up like 1 or 2 percentage points, which is significant considering where we've been. Number 3, you could have your largest Easter or Christmas / special day attendance in your church's history. If you would do it well, push for it. Number 4, vertical video is not going anywhere, so invest in it. And then number 5, your Sunday experience will determine if people stay. And those are my 2025 church predictions. Here is my observation for this episode. And my observation is the reminder for the need to create clear expectations for feedback when newer preachers are preaching at your church. So I see this sometimes in the Practical Church Facebook group. I had a friend who was asking me about this the other week, how when someone who is a new person that's on staff on their church and was preaching for the first time. And I just want to say, I think a really big missed opportunity for when it comes to someone who's maybe on staff or at your church and is going to start preaching more, is you need to create expectation that like after your sermon, we're going to talk and I'm going to give you feedback. If you don't do that, then you're going to leave. It might be awkward, or you're going to just kind of leave it up to choice or to chance. So my encouragement is if you have someone who is a newer preacher, hasn't preached very often, especially has never preached before, like these are big ones, you should set up first of all, you should go over the sermon with them before they preach. But you should also set up, hey, like, after you're done, we're going to talk through like how things went so they can expect it and it's not awkward and weird. Like your people will not get better without, I mean, obviously reps help, but reps with intentionality and feedback is really important. So my observation is like, maybe this is obvious, but I've just seen it maybe enough times that I guess it's not, is like create the expectation for your newer preachers that we're going to talk through the sermon after you do it. So we can talk through, here's what didn't go well for the next time. Otherwise, it's kind of like, you're just kind of leaving it up to their subjective chance. And you're also leaving it up to, I think it was Craig Rochelle. I don't know if it was original to him. I'm going to butcher it now, but he talked about how like a sign that you're like new at something or not great at something is how often people compliment you. So if you preach for the first time, here's what happened. You'll get a lot of, hey, that was great. Hey, thanks so much. That really encouraged me. You're going to get a lot of that. If you preach every week, you don't get that anymore because like people have this expectation, right? And so if you only leave it to like the people who hear the sermon, they're going to get a lot of encouragement. Nobody's going to tell someone who's a new preacher, hey man, that was really bad, or point 3 didn't make a lot of sense, or I was confused about this. Like you're not really going to get that. And so I would just say, hey man, create an expectation that there's going to be feedback, and then actually give feedback if you want your newer preachers to be better. Well, here is my personal growth tip for this episode, and that is that you need to be thinking of practices, not goals. Practices are more important than goals. Here's what I mean. When trying to create a new discipline in your life, think in terms of daily or weekly practices, not goals. So for example, if you want to read more books, don't think I want to read 30 books in a year, but you should think I want to read 30 minutes a day. If you want to learn how to code and build a website from scratch, don't think I'm going to build a website in 3 months. That's just a goal. What you should think is I'm going to take X class, a certain class, and do 4 hours of study, work, and/or training a week. I'm going to take a course and dedicate 4 hours a week to study, work, and training on it. If you want to learn how to take better pictures of nature, don't think I'm going to increase the number of likes on my pictures by 10x on Instagram or whatever. But rather, you should think I'm going to spend 15 minutes a day watching YouTube videos on photography and then spend 10 minutes taking pictures, right? You want a habit, not a goal. See, the problem with setting goals is that you can't measure whether or not you are successful with it until the end, until you actually pass or fail your goal. And of course, the further away your goal is, for example, if you want to accomplish something over the course of an entire year, the longer you have to wait until you feel any sort of accomplishment, if at all, if you even hit your goal. So you have a whole year or whatever before you feel any sort of accomplishment or satisfaction if all you have is a goal. What's worse is that we also can feel a lot of resistance to course correct a goal. So instead of altering a goal that we say, hey, I shot too far, or now that I learned some more things, I realized that my original goal isn't realistic, I need to change it. Instead of altering our goal that we were perhaps too ambitious for in the beginning when we were more naive about it, we simply give up on it completely because we realize, well, actually, I can't hit that. And so we don't course correct, we just give up. It's much easier, can I just say, it is much easier to alter our daily or weekly practices. It is easier to do that than to alter some goal that you think you can no longer hit. So for example, if you find that reading 30 minutes a day isn't manageable, it's really easy to say, you know what, I'm just going to read for 20. If you find 4 hours a week of coding work is too much, you can say, you know what, I'm just going to code for 2. If you find 25 minutes a day of photography training isn't enough because of how much you enjoy it, like you want to do it more, well, then you can train for 30 minutes. You can train for 40 minutes. Like just change your habit. Don't focus so much on the goal. Hear me. I'm not saying goals are wrong. Not saying they're wrong. But before you create a goal, you need to create a habit. If you don't have the habit to sustain you, you will never hit your goal. All right, well, today's ministry question comes somewhat from the Practical Church Facebook group. So if you're on Facebook, be sure to join the Practical Church Facebook group. You can ask questions, talk with other ministry leaders, that sort of thing. Somebody asked recently, and I've just seen this a lot, so I'm not going to call like a specific question, but somebody was asking recently like how to plan a long sermon series. I think this one was the book of Exodus, but regardless, I've seen this a couple times. Like how do you plan to preach through a long book of the Bible? Here are just some quick thoughts that I have. I think it's helpful to break it up. So we preached through Exodus, for example, a couple years ago. I think it was the upper 30 weeks. And so we took like 2 or 3. It depends on how your church typically does this. We predominantly preach through books of the Bible. So we took like, I think 2 maybe 3, I don't know. At least 2 like 4 to 5 short mini series breaks, like a topical series or whatever. Like right now we're preaching through the book of Acts. And so I think that'll take us about 40-ish weeks. I'm not even fully sure. I'll explain why in a second. We started in August. We preached all the way through December. Then a special Christmas thing. Here in January, we're doing a series on doctrine for 4 weeks. And then in February, we're going back into Acts. So I think it's helpful, one, to break it up a little bit. I think it is helpful to like search online for outlines or post in the Practical Church Facebook group, for example, like this person did. Like, hey, has anyone preached through this book? Can I see how you broke it down? I think that's helpful. And the other thing I would really encourage is like, it's going to be really hard to nail it. In other words, if you're going to preach 40 weeks in a certain series and you're trying to plan out, okay, each week, maybe people have a different experience with this. I think it's pretty hard to like get like what you thought you would do before you started preaching the book to what actually happened. So my encouragement is to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. Like don't like write it in stone and like, here's what we're going to do, because like here's the hard thing. I've experienced it multiple times. You've got like, okay, this person, most people preach like these many verses or this passage, together. And then you start prepping on the sermon. You're like, man, like for whatever reason, like I can't get through this much. So I got to like cut it. So stuff like that will happen. And if you force yourself into a box and think, okay, here is the book plan, the outline, and I've got to stick with it, I think that'll be limiting to you. I think one of the challenges, maybe why this has not been as hard for me, is I'm about 3 to 4 weeks ahead of sermon prep. I've got episodes. You can scroll back down and find my sermon prep process. I'm not sure what episode number is off the top of my head, but it's you can scroll down and look through the episodes. What's helpful for me is like, I'm not like preaching the sermon, but I'm about 4-ish weeks ahead of like sermon prep. So like when I'm writing a sermon in the book of Acts, for example, I can be flexible because it's like, oh, I actually didn't read these many verses, or actually I'm going to get through more verses. That typically doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. Sometimes it's whatever. I can be flexible knowing like I'm actually 4 weeks ahead, so I can adjust the sermon preaching calendar. It doesn't matter. That is harder to do when you are, as most people do, which is fine. That is harder to do when you're preaching week to week, because it's like, oh, I've got a whole chapter, and then you realize that's too much, or I really want to focus on like this passage. And so it can be hard when you're like writing the sermon. So I want to say that's hard too. So my encouragement is like, look online, post in the Facebook group and ask people like, how did you break down this book of the Bible? But give yourself some grace. Like don't assume that like if it's over 20 weeks, anything over 20 weeks, like it's going to be exactly as you planned it. Give yourself some grace. And just know like, it might be a little bit different when you actually start working on it. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that is how I look at and plan longer books through books of the Bible and preaching through them. Well, thanks so much again for joining me today on the Practical Church Podcast. I hope you enjoyed these church predictions, and we'll see by the end of next year where I'm at. If you want more from Mission Support, which is our partner at putting this episode or this show together, be sure to go to missionsupport.com today. Again, SEO, payroll, websites. They've got a ton of services, super helpful. Best thing about them is they don't do contracts. So like at any point, hey, you say, hey, this is not working, you can end it. You don't have to be stuck into like this 2 or 3 year deal, paying money for something that you don't want or that you can't change. So big fan of Mission Support. Check them out. If you want more from me, you can always go to dylandotson.com and connect with me there. I'll be back with you in 2 weeks for another episode of the Practical Church Podcast.